Good morning, Mr. Procedural. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Minister.
Good morning, Chair.
Yes, Mr. Procedural.
Thank you. Morning, Minister Gordhan.
Good morning.
The next topic you deal with in your statement is the issue of the closure of the Gupta bank accounts, which is an issue covered directly by the Commission's terms of reference. You deal with that at paragraph 138 of your statement, and you deal in particular with your personal participation in the issues surrounding the closure of the bank's accounts, or the bank accounts. Would you deal with then what happened in April 2016 when Oak Bay Investments announced that its bank accounts had been closed?
Thank you, Chair, and good morning again. In essence, there are sort of three issues in this section. The first was, of course, in relation to the pressure both from Oak Bay Investments in the form of Nazim Hawa and repeated letters, and I think we had 2 meetings with him to try to explain to him in a gentle way that we will not and we cannot intervene in this matter of the bank accounts. And similar pressure coming from within our own ranks in government. So the essence of that would be that neither I nor any Treasury official would meet the banks, so to speak, or intervene in this matter. The second, Chairperson, is that the so-called subcommittee, which Mr. Zwane chaired, which I'll refer to in a moment, and other comments that were being made both inside and outside of Cabinet, required that, on the basis of legal advice that I had, that we do something illegal, i.e. tell the banks to act otherwise, and we refused to do that. And when we couldn't get a sufficient understanding of the legal position, we decided to approach the court to get the clarity on this particular matter, although it came a bit late. So in paragraph 138, we describe the interactions with Mr. Hawa and the explanations that we've offered him on the matter of intervening in this particular case. 138.2.
Sorry, if I could interrupt you there, Minister. Prior to meeting with the representatives of Oak Bay, did you consider the legal position and take legal advice?
Well, we had our own internal legal advice in the first instance, that we can't intervene, and our own understanding of the Banks Act and the way in which we would be required to interact with the bank, or banks in this particular regard. And then we obtained external opinions as well.
And did you meet with representatives of Oak Bay, as you describe in paragraph 138.2?
Yes, as I indicated, there was both correspondence and 1 or maybe 2 meetings to explain to them that we will not intervene, we can't intervene. And in addition, we actually said that they should go to court. If they feel they have a case, go to court. And if I'm right, I recollect a letter from them, Chair, which said they don't think they have a good prospect in court, which is quite an admission on their part. So that's the essence of 138.2.
And then in paragraph 139, you deal with the Ministerial task team, and you contrast that with an interministerial committee.
To deal with the question of intervention in this matter.
Just to take you back to, excuse me, to paragraph 138.2. Are you quite clear in your own mind that what you were being requested by these entities was effectively to intervene and stop the banks from what they were doing in terms of closing their accounts? In
Yes.
other words, there can be no doubt that that was the request.
Yes,
Thank you.
very explicitly.
Thank you.
Would you relate to the Commission, please, your interactions or otherwise with the task team, as you describe in paragraph 140 of your statement?
But as I said, the task team was established on the 13th of April. I was, again, not at that meeting. I think I was at the IMF meetings in Washington at the time. The members that were initially assigned to that task team were Mr. Zwane, Ms. Oliphant, and myself. And as I indicated in 140, later the Minister of Communications was added. And at a subsequent occasion, when I saw some of the minutes or notes of a discussion that they had, or a meeting that they had, for some reason, SARS and many others were invited to that meeting as well. I don't actually have access to that right now. So, in my view, this was a political crowding in of like-minded people who would share a common view and who would act contrary to the legal advice that we had. And I would get very short notice of one or two meetings, and I would refuse to accept that, firstly because the structure began to call itself an IMC, and I asked the Cabinet Secretary whether, in fact, this was an IMC, and he concurred that it wasn't. And secondly, who chaired the structure? Mr. Zwane appeared to declare himself the chair, so at a subsequent Cabinet meeting, the President indicated that, well, he's the chair. So that was the case. But I didn't attend any of its meetings, understanding politically where it was coming from, what its object was, and I refused to be part of that process.
The invitation from page 711, Chair.
Yes.
In that letter dated the 20th of April 2016, Minister Zwane says, I refer to the decision taken by Cabinet on Wednesday, 16 April 2016, to appoint an interministerial committee to consider the impact of certain allegedly unilateral actions taken by specific financial institutions against certain of its clients, which actions may have the potential to negatively affect the economy of the Republic of South Africa, with particular focus to be given to the impact of these actions on the already distressed mining and financial services sectors. Is that, as you understand, the mandate of that committee?
Well, that's the mandate that's included in this letter.
Your response to Minister Zwane appears at page 714 of the same bundle. where you make the point, amongst others, that no interministerial committee was established and that no one minister was designated as convener. You also take issues with other contents of Minister Zwane's letter. Do you have any comment to clarify your response?
Well, this is a written proof of what I've just said, Chairperson, in respect of the structure, its standing, its chairpersonship, and the fact that we were obtaining legal advice. So,
in paragraph 142.
I'm sorry, Mr. Pretorius. I may have missed something earlier on which I would like to have clarification on now. I think at some stage, either today or in the past 2 days, you may have sought to make a distinction between an interministerial committee and I think some other structure. If there is, please, would you just repeat that distinction? And I just want to understand whether it's of any significance here.
I'm not sure about the significance, but as I said earlier, Chair, the IMC, and there are many of them. I think recently the presidency was taking stock of which ones are still needed and which are not. So by its nature, for example, you will have an IMC on mining towns. It's chaired by Minister Hadebe. And this is post the Marikana situation to actually ensure that housing and other facilities are actually provided in mining towns, but also look at the rehabilitation of mines and in particular, if you like, develop a social plan for those communities that are affected in those areas. Now clearly a structure like that would require the Human Settlements Department, Water and Sanitation Department, the local government or COCTA department and so on, to become involved. So you can see there are many departments, one objective, and they all contribute to the objective and the program that emerges.
Because of your view, which you've already expressed to the Chair.
Yes.
Can I also ask, I think you make the point in your letter to Mr. Zwane that no person had been designated as chairperson. I do recall, and I'm sure Mr. Pretorius will deal with this in due course, that at a later stage there seemed to be some repudiation of either the statement or the committee by the then president. Mm-hmm. So maybe one must come back and simply say, as a matter of fact, was a committee established by cabinet to do more or less what Mr. Zwane was talking about in his letter?
Yes, a committee was established at the meeting of the 13th of April. No chairperson was declared explicitly. At the following cabinet meeting, he was
those proceedings in Cabinet have not been obtained and declassified by our investigators, but that is work still to be done. We will do so and raise issues relating thereto when appropriate. If you could deal then with the matter raised in paragraph 143, and that is the media statement issued by Mr. Zwane on the 1st of September 2016.
Yeah, if I may just elaborate on what you said, Mr. Pretorius and Chairperson. What the significance of 142 is that Mr. Zwane does produce 2 or 3 reports from the task team, allegedly, and it's advisable for the Commission to get hold of those just to give you a feel for what happened. And now it's on the basis of those meetings or interactions that were held, and of course the banks themselves can also inform the Commission about the nature of their interactions as well. But at 143, what we are talking about is that there was a unilateral statement made by Mr. Zwane in which he says all sorts of things, including rebuking the banks and for telling government, as this article says, how to run the country, and various other factors as well. And his statement is then repudiated by Cabinet as being not a true reflection of what Cabinet's views are. And I believe that is at 719. Yes.
So the repudiation wasn't just by the former president, it was by the cabinet. I'm just
Well, yeah, no, it says the presidency. So
I'm just asking because from the media at the
Yes.
time, I seem to remember
No,
that
so it's
the
the
impression was that it was the president.
Well, may I refer to 2 reports that apparently clarify the situation?
That's fine.
Mr. Gordhan, would you go to page 717 of bundle N1B? There's a report there of Minister Zwane's statement made at a meeting of the National Union of Mine Workers during June 2016, where he's reported as rebuking the banks for telling the government how to run the country, a statement to which you've just referred.
Yes.
At the bottom of that report on page 717 is a reported statement by the ANC Secretary General at the time, Mr. Mantashe, who urged the government not to meddle in relationship between Guptas and their banks, saying that the state must allow them to sort out their differences. And the article points out the differences of opinion within the governing party. But statement to which I think the Chair may be referring appears at page 719, which says, under the photograph of Minister Zwane, the Presidency on Friday distanced itself from a statement made by Mineral Resources Minister Mosebenzi Zwane that the Cabinet had resolved to request that a judicial inquiry be established into the banks and their actions against the Guptas, as well as to review the legislation that governs the banking system. Is that the record of statements as you recall them?
Yes. And I think what 719 reveals, Chair, is the sheer recklessness of the kind of statements that are made as in 717. And if you look at the last paragraph of 719, then after the recklessness has occurred, then suddenly we realize we have investors, we have a banking system that we need to secure, and then we'll offer reassurances that everything is fine.
That reassurance is given in the last paragraph on page 719.
That's right.
Well, excuse me. I see in one of the paragraphs in the body of the statement that the then presidential state spokesperson, Mr. Bongani Mngulunga, is quoted as having said, I'm sure speaking about Minister Zwane, he does not speak on behalf of Cabinet, and the contents of his statement do not reflect the position or views of the Cabinet, the Presidency, or government. So that might indicate that not only the President, but also the Cabinet distanced itself from his statement.
Because it wasn't a true reflection.
It wasn't a true reflection of the Cabinet's position. Yeah, they might not have done something to distance themselves, but what it was saying was that Minister Zwane's statement did not reflect the true position of Cabinet and President and government on the issue.
That's right.
Thank you.
The outcome of that, as I understand it, Minister Gordhan, was that a dispute arose subsequently as to whether the statement of Minister Zwane was made in his personal capacity or not. And that was the subject of a parliamentary question which appears at page 725 of the bundle. Would you place that on record, please? And the reply, which is on the following page, 726.
This is a parliamentary question to the President from Mr. Menier of the DA, and the response to that question was the following. I had indicated in my previous reply that the statement issued by the Minister of Mineral Resources, Mr. Zwane, on 1 September 2016 on the work of the task team established to consider the implications of the decisions of certain banks and audit firms to close down the accounts and withdraw audit services from the company named Oak Bay Investments was issued in his personal capacity and not on behalf of the task team or Cabinet. I am not in the position to answer why Mr. Zwane, in his reply on 22 September 2016, said that he was not speaking in his personal capacity. The question in this regard must be directed to the Minister. I reprimanded the Minister for the statement.
Then in paragraph 144, you refer to the court application launched by yourself for declaratory relief regarding what powers you might or might not have had to intervene in decisions taken by commercial banks. That application appears at page 728 and following, and is responsible for a large volume of paper on your bench, Chair. It's not necessary for us to go into any detail on that application for the reason that it's been thoroughly dealt with in evidence before this Commission already, but I invite you to raise any issue in relation to the application that you wish to.
Just to record, Chair, that there was the application, as I indicated earlier, that in 144.2 I indicate that the Financial Intelligence Center, as I pointed out yesterday, indicated as part of the application that 72 suspicious transaction reports had been provided, or they had been provided those reports from various banks relating to suspicious account activity and transactions conducted using the bank accounts that had been closed, that this matter then goes on, as I say, in 144.2. This was the first public acknowledgement of suspicions regarding the business affairs of the Gupta entities since the Public Protector's State of Capture report was only released to the public on 2 November 2016.
Those reports, for the record, Minister, appear in the bundle N1B at page 830 to 833. They are listed in full there. We needn't go there, but they may be the subject of further investigation and evidence before the Commission.
We will come back to this application in a different way under the section on my dismissal, because on the Tuesday of that week was the hearing in relation to this application in the North Gauteng High Court. And the Monday is when we were instructed to come back immediately, but we'll come back to that.
And then you make a submission to the Commission in paragraph 145. I have certain questions I'd like to ask, if I may, in relation to the suggestion that the Commission should follow the money. Would you place that on record, please?
Yes, follow the money, apart from paying back the money, is a popular retort when one speaks to particularly forensic experts. If you ask what kind of malfeasance took place and where did the money go, and how do you catch the culprits, it says follow the money. So let me read into the record 145, Chair. I submit to the Commission that it should follow the money and request a full account of all transactions by any Gupta-related company and related individuals that has gone through bank accounts. By doing so, it will be better placed to determine which activities were related to criminality and malfeasance. This will assist the state-owned enterprises and taxpayers to recover funds lost in this process as well.
Dealing briefly with the recovery of funds, we know, Minister, that there are two categories of our law which can be utilized to recover funds lost through malfeasance. The first is the criminal system, justice system. There will be evidence before the Commission in relation to the criminal justice system and its duty to recover funds and what is being done in that regard. My question relates to civil recovery of funds. Would you inform the Commission, please, in your present position as Minister of Public Enterprises, whether civil methods are being considered, will be used in relation to state-owned entities' loss of finances?
Certainly, Chair. The boards of the various SOEs, as I said earlier, looking at or into the forensic reports that are currently available or those that they have initiated. Secondly, there is one example of the Transnet board claiming, I think, 166 million rands from the former CEO for money paid to, I think, its regiments for work basically not done at that particular point in time. So there will be those sorts of procedures. There also are huge opportunities available to us through the Financial Intelligence Center network across the globe. And tax authorities also have similar reach in different jurisdictions, depending on the kind of double taxation treaties and so on that they have, and mutual assistance agreements that they have in place as well. But if I may recommend, the one avenue that needs to be exercised a lot more, even now, in relation to any malfeasance that is in the public domain, is the asset forfeiture process. So I think there are a number of opportunities for the state to ensure that those who are engaged in these sorts of activities feel the first signs of pain by freezing their assets, which might include 5 Lamborghinis or 10 Ferraris or whatever the case might be. And that will then send the right message that malfeasance is not to be tolerated.
Just for the reassurance of the Public Minister, is there a coordinated campaign, whether at ministerial, departmental level or at an SOE level, to investigate all civil means of recovery and to act on all investigations in that regard?
I indicated, I think, on the first day of my testimony that the department is currently going through that process of bringing together information, including all the forensic reports available across the SOEs we are responsible for, so that we get some kind of overview of what is going on.
And certainly that will form part of the activities of the Commission going forward. Would you then please deal with the nuclear deal in this latter period of your office as Minister of Finance?
Chair, the best way to deal with this, if I may submit, is to look at a declassified memo and minutes of the, I think we have minutes here, I'm just going to check, or I think it might be in the file, on this particular matter that went before Cabinet. And so I think these are the minutes. So at 712 of a meeting on the 9th of December 2015, the day on which Minister Nene was dismissed, it reads as follows.
I'm sorry, Minister, before you go on, may I ask what page are you referring to?
I just pulled this out, so it's numbered 445, but I'm not sure which of your bundles.
May I ask you, just for the sake of order, to look at page 39 of the supplementary bundle.
Thank you, that's helpful.
Yes, would you?
So I'll just
read
that.
This document has been declassified.
Yes.
So at 712, chairperson of that page, the Cabinet A requested that the last sentence in the first paragraph under paragraph 9 be deleted. That's with reference to the Cabinet Memorandum. B, approved that the Department of Energy issue the request for proposal, or RFP, for a nuclear new build program of 9,600 megawatts of nuclear power. C, approved that the final funding model be informed by the response of the market to the RFP and thereafter be submitted to Cabinet for final consideration. And D, requested that, where relevant, the exchange rates referred to in the memorandum be adjusted to current values. So you'll recall that I made this point quite elaborately, I think sometime yesterday or the day before, that if exchange rates are wrongly quoted, it then affects the whole cost structure and the final result that you obtain about the cost of a project. So clearly there was a misestimate or the wrong number was put in for whatever reason to arrive at the costs. And what we learned from here, Chair, is that whilst there was an approval for the RFP, the funding model had still to be defined and determined.
For those not familiar with the tender process, Minister, the RFP would stand for Request for Proposals, which is an initiation of the acquisition and procurement process. May I ask, just for clarification, Minister, the status of the nuclear build program prior to this in relation to Cabinet approval, what was it? Had Cabinet approved the program prior to this date in any form or other? Or was it a matter of investigation and consideration? What was the position?
I think, again, I'm not sure what's classified and what's not. So I suggest, Chair, that
Yes.
you approach the Cabinet Secretary to inform you of that.
Yes, I think just feel free where you are not sure to indicate that you are not sure. You may be giving information that hasn't been disclassified.
Thank you.
And then indicate only that which you are comfortable.
Sure.
Is not will not breach any secrecy of Cabinet. Yeah.
We could go back, Chair, to the evidence of Mr. Nene, which dealt in some detail with the interactions between the Department of Energy on the one hand and Treasury on the other at a level below Cabinet, but that evidence is there. May I just put one more question then to you, Mr. Minister Gordhan, in relation to the nature of the approval here. There has been evidence that, as at this stage, Treasury had not yet considered or advised on a final funding model for the nuclear build program. Am I correct?
And that's yes, you are. And it's reflected in some ways in paragraph 147, that the Chief Procurement Officer was still seeking legal opinions, and 4 lines down it says that it requires that state institutions procure goods or services using a system that is fair, equitable, transparent, competitive, and cost-effective, and that's what results in the RFP being the instrument through which we actually work. And the latter part of this section says, moreover, the RFP documentation that had been prepared had many flaws and gaps identified not only by the National Treasury officials, but also in reports produced by advisors working on behalf of the Department of Energy. And the Department of Energy, Chair, would be in the best position to provide you with those documents and the work that the advisors had done for them.
So, excuse me, this approval by Cabinet, as reflected in these minutes, was it an approval that occurred before the full costs of the project was known to Cabinet, or the full costs were known already? It was just the funding model that was still to be determined.
I think, Chair, the Minister Nene would probably have indicated to you that there were 2 sets of calculations, if you like, and all of them would be estimates, one from the Treasury, one from the Department of Energy. What an RFP does, and which is what the resolution suggests as well, once you ask the marketplace, if you say, I require X, then, and if there are 5 or 10 different providers that are interested in providing you with X, they will also provide you with the cost and how they arrive at those costs as well. It then gives you a basis for comparison on the one hand, but also an indication of what the market is saying about the cost of the commodity that you actually want to acquire. So the RFP or RFI sometimes is used to test the market, to see what is it that's actually available, who are the vendors that are available, and what could be the cost consequences. So, and that is why I think the resolution says that the funding model, so if the funding is for, let's say 200 billion rands instead of 1 trillion rands, then the funding model will take a different shape and direction. If it's 2 trillion rands instead of 1 trillion rand, then equally it will take a different direction as well. So testing the market is an important part. Of course, in this process, what's often hidden is what's the specifications that you are putting out in the RFP. You can't just say, I want to buy X without defining what is X. So am I buying a 6-cylinder car or a 4-cylinder car or an old car or a new car or whatever the case might be. So you've got to define what is it that you want and what are, if you like, the additional conveniences that you might want in your car as well, and specify them in explicit terms. So then you can compare apple for apple. Now, in tender malfeasance, what you often have, or you sometimes have, are instances where the provider actually influences the specs or specifications. So you influence me as an official to put in these specifications, I do so, and then you bid because you've had foreknowledge of the specifications that are going to be required, or you might be one of the few people, your company might be one of the few that actually have the capability to provide a particular kind of specification that's indicated in the RFP itself. So you might need a procurement expert at some stage to come in, go through the whole value chain and explain how malfeasance can intervene in the course of that value chain.
So would it be, it probably would be right to say, although this was approval, it was, whether this says so expressly or not, but it was subject to certain things happening.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
So in summary then, Minister, is it fair to say that as at the date of this Cabinet resolution on the 9th of December 2018, the market had not yet been tested, would be tested through the issuing of a request for proposals and responses thereto, and once that had been done, the funding model would be developed to meet that information?
That's right.
Then in paragraph 148 and following, you deal with the relationship between Eskom as a state-owned entity on the one hand and the nuclear project on the other. Would you detail that, please, for the Commission?
If I may cover 148, 149, and the rest of the paragraphs in this section very quickly for you, given the time constraints that we have. In 148 and 149, what is made reference to is that at an earlier stage, I think Eskom was designated as the owner of this nuclear project. And once you speak to the Cabinet Secretariat, you might be able to get more clarity on that. I think what 148 is indicating is that Eskom was now involved in the new build projects of Medupi, Kusile, and Ngula. And it would have funding constraints. Although the PR at that time, from Mr. Molefe, the then CEO, varied on this particular question. And what 148 and 149 is then saying is that since Eskom has funding constraints and won't be able to provide funding, the Cabinet should approve that NEXA, the South African National Energy Corporation, should replace Eskom as the implementing agent. And by implementing, it's more than just the implementing agent, because it will also be, if you like, the owner and operator of the power stations that emerge from this particular process. I think 149 just gives you some indications of the financial difficulties that Eskom found itself in at that point in time. And Eskom itself was the subject of capture during this particular period as well, and we'll come back to that in a moment. At 150, we indicate, and 151, that there were a number of civil society organizations that then launched legal proceedings against the Minister of Energy, the President, and Eskom, among others, and that, as indicated in 151, finally the Cape High Court ruled that the nuclear cooperation agreements with the USA, Russia, South Korea were unconstitutional and unlawful, and that the ministerial determination for a 9.6 gigawatt nuclear new build for South Africa was invalid. So this saga or stage of the nuclear issue ends with that court action.
That order is at page 2700 of bundle N1F, Chair. We needn't go there. It's quite a detailed and technical application, and for the sake of time, it will probably be dealt with in due course. But in fairness, both to Mr. Molefe and yourself, Minister, may I ask you to turn to page 2626 of bundle N1F, which is the last bundle. N1F.
What's the page number?
2626.
Yes.
In that article published by Engineering News, Mr. Molefe sets out a different view about funding for the nuclear build program, and says, perhaps I'm not doing justice to the proposition by attempting to summarize it, because it's obviously quite technical, but says that the nuclear build program could be self-financing, and in fact would repay its cost in 15 to 20 years, even if it did cost 1 trillion rand, and pointing out that a nuclear plant has a life of 80 years. Do you have any comment in that regard?
Well, Mr. Molefe has skills that he's learned at the Treasury, where he was nurtured, as I said, by Ms. Ramos and Mr. Manuel for many years in this particular area of financing. So clearly he had something on his mind. It's not explicit here. Safe to say that the fiscus doesn't have to be the funder. But the fiscus could be called on as a guarantor, if not the funder. So without the detail, it's hard to comment on this matter any further.
It's a technical matter, it seems. Then if you would go to the issue raised by Mr. Maseko in evidence before the Commission in relation to the memorandum signed by himself and other former Directors General and addressed to the President, the Deputy President, other Cabinet members and yourself. He gave evidence, which is a matter of record, that the memorandum was presented to yourself and that there was a very little response, I think, in summary, from anyone there, save the ANC's own initiative. If you could just deal with that, please.
Well, this was a context when there was heightened concern, both about corruption, but also about diminishing the capacity of state institutions and the public service more generally. In that context, former Directors General decided to meet and to establish whether, having shared this concern, they would like to express it in some way. That resulted in this document called the Memorandum that Mr. Maseko referred to. And it was in a context where there was a lot of activism from civil society organizations on this and other related matters as well. I did respond to Mr. Maseko's plea, if you like, but also the fact that the memorandum had been delivered to me by having a chat on the phone, but on the understanding that that kind of activism needs to keep itself going, and it didn't actually in the ultimate instance, but is an important part of civil society and importantly senior former civil servants being part of the process of alerting the public to what was going on in the state at that time. So I don't think there was any other expectation from our side, because we were all, if you like, part of the struggle against the kind of undermining of public service institutions that was happening at the time.
Was there any discussion in relation to any possible response between the recipients of the memorandum?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Did you discuss it with the President, with the Deputy President?
No.
I understand, though, that following this memorandum, the governing party established its own initiative to deal with state capture. What happened to that?
Well, I think the governing party appears before you next week, and they're in the best position to answer. But it didn't receive much of a response. I believe Mr. Maseko did respond, but there are many others who considered responding but didn't. And they were probably waiting for processes like yours, Chair, where they could make their case known. And of course, a reliable integrity committee within the governing party as well, which we now have.
You say here in paragraph 152 that it was only Mr. Maseko that lodged a submission with the ANC following its call for information. Is that correct as far as you're concerned?
As far as I know, yes.
And that nothing further came of the initiative as far as you're aware?
That's right.
The fact that these issues of state capture had been raised, and had been raised with the executive by people who one would presume had knowledge of malfeasance within various departments, and the response both of the recipients of the memorandum and the own initiative of the ruling party. With hindsight, are you of the view that that was sufficient or acceptable?
As I said, I think there were a multitude of activities taking place, both within the governing party, within the state, including the executive, and outside of the state, through various formations. There were any number of court actions at the time, if you recall, Chair, and other forms of activism, depending on the issue that obtained at a particular point in time. And you're talking about, Chair, a context in which the executive itself was beginning to be compromised and a difficult terrain in which to operate. So we're not talking about honest brokers sitting around a table where one can, in a collegial way, say, you know, Mr. Maseko is very concerned, as our former DGs, about what's happening to the public service. Can we work out what arrangement we could have to respond to their concerns? Life didn't work that way in that particular context. And it's this overall milieu that you need to take into account, Chair, of opposition to the wrong things, but also the insistence on carrying on with the wrong things as well at that time. So it's that contestation that we have, and which continued, and which continues in a different form today.
Thank you.
I wonder whether or maybe I should put the question this way. Is the lack of response to the invitation by the governing party to its members to come forward is the lack of response, because it seems that it was maybe one or two people who responded to, as far as the public knows. Obviously one doesn't know what went on inside. Could it in any way be said to be a reflection of the extent to which maybe some of its own members, that is the governing party, might not have had confidence that it could handle these kinds of issues properly or the way they would expect?
That's one possibility, Chair. The other is the reality that there was a climate of fear. Fear for one's life, fear for one's family, fear of losing one's job, fear of being compromised in terms of maybe future career prospects. But that climate of fear in the more formal sense shouldn't be underestimated, because we already had, as Mr. Nene himself pointed out, all sorts of so-called intelligence reports, which we're going to come to in this context as well, and conspiracy theories, but also conspiratorial acts being performed at that time. And that does create a climate that's not conducive to easily reaching confidence in some of these processes. But I suppose different colleagues in the governing party or in the executive might have different perspectives on this, and as they appear before you, you might want to explore that.
Thank you.
Yes, certainly, Minister, the issue will be considered in relation to leading evidence before the Commission as to how state capture, if it is proven to exist, occurred, how it could flourish, and what needs to be done to prevent it happening again. But that's an ongoing process, and we can assure the public and the Commission that it will be investigated fully on an ongoing basis. At paragraph 153, Minister, you deal with your removal as Minister of Finance, and that occurred in March 2017. Would you detail the prior travel that you undertook to the United Kingdom and the intended travel to the United States, the purpose of that travel, and in particular whether it was authorized travel or not?
Again, to assist you with time, Chair, if I can quickly summarize the response to Mr. Pretorius's question. As I indicated to you, this is a normal process that follows both the medium-term budget policy statement and the budget itself, and it's a long-held tradition established in the Treasury, and that the Treasury and the Reserve Bank would undertake these roadshows, as they're called. Some of them are what we call information roadshows. This is what the budget is about. This is where we're heading. Some of them are combined with funding, raising funding as well. So in the course of the roadshow, colleagues in the Treasury would test the market and see whether there are investors in the right mode, meaning going to offer you money at the right price or an interest rate. And if that is the case, either when we come back or during the course of the visit, a bond will be raised, $1 billion, $1.5 billion. And often those are oversubscribed, given the good rates of return that people receive. Secondly, these visits can only take, or these roadshows can only take place as far as ministers are concerned, because officials get their consent from ministers, but ministers get their consent from the presidency. So we submit an itinerary, give a rationale for the travel, and obtain approval before travel arrangements are finalized. And that was the case as indicated in paragraph 153. 154, we indicate that on this particular occasion, Mr. Fuzile, the then Director General, and I would be traveling to London overnight on Sunday, the 26th of March. Former Deputy Minister Jonas was due to fly to New York on the Tuesday, so he wasn't going to join us in London. He was going to go directly to New York. Once Mr. Fuzile and I had completed a two-day set of interactions in London, Mr. Fuzile will then join Mr. Jonas in New York, and they would continue with the US leg of the roadshow. This was also an occasion on which business had joined us in London, and I think Labour joined later on the US leg of the visit. 155 indicates that as literally the tire hit the tarmac at Heathrow Airport, I put my phone on, and there was a message from the Director General in the Presidency instructing both, well, all of us, the Minister, the Deputy Minister, and the Director General to return immediately. Now, immediately means get on to the next flight available. The next flight wasn't 5 minutes away, it was in the evening. So the question was, what do we do with our time? But also, the Deputy Minister wasn't with us. The approval would have been granted for him to travel to New York. So nobody bothered to check that clearly before that message was sent. Mr. Fuzile and I, at 156, then discussed the message and said that we owe a responsibility to the meetings that had been scheduled, which included 2 meetings with ratings agencies and then with a range of investors. I think Mr. Jabu Mabuza and Ms. Nikki Newton-King were already in London and were part of our team. So for the rest of the day, we said, let's meet the investors and interact with the ratings agencies. There was one ratings agency that we were going to meet the next day, but obviously we were not going to be there the next day any longer. And we then scheduled a telephone conference with them, if I can recall. And we then had our flights rescheduled for later that evening to return to South Africa, as 156 indicates. If I may continue, Mr. Pretorius, is that okay?
Yes, please.
At 157, Chair, on the same day, that's on Monday, former President Zuma reportedly informed senior leaders of the SACP, that is the Communist Party, that he intended to remove me and former Deputy Minister Jonas, and referenced a purported intelligence report accusing me and others of conspiring with foreign forces against him as president. Of course, I reject and deny these allegations, and I never saw the report as a whole. However,
if you would go,
the Commission
please.
has got a nice photograph of me waving this report, so I'll wave it again. But it's not the report, it's only 2 pages.
Let's take it step by step, Minister.
Right. So
Freeman.
that's the 2 pages there.
The pages 1 and 2 of the supplementary bundle.
That's for the Chair.
Contain a document headed Part 1 text. It's a 2-page document. And despite our own investigative efforts, we haven't been able to find anything else that purports to be an intelligence report. When you say you never saw this intelligence report, just explain, please, to the Chair what you mean by that.
Well, if this is alleged to be 2 pages of a report, then we haven't seen the report, we've seen the 2 pages. Secondly, this was circulating by the time we got back on Twitter and WhatsApp and so on. So it was easy to get hold of this. once we heard from either the public domain or from the Communist Party that there was the so-called intelligence report. Of course, the President is in the best position to answer whether there's a report or whether there's just those 2 pages. And of course, this has got some ludicrous suggestions that very prominent bankers and others have set up meetings with banks and investment bankers in the UK and the USA to have official meetings to discuss South Africa's financial markets. They've also set up secret meetings to start what is called Operation Checkmate. Now, not all of us are fans of chess, I might say, but anyway, it's interesting terminology that these people that operate in the conspiratorial terrain come up with. It then indicates all 3 of us were going to be fired, and that there will be some proof of what they are selling of the corruption by the Guptas and how the investment banks need to stand to fight the president, and so on. So that's the report, Chair. At 1:58,
I'm sorry, let me just make sure I understand the position. So this document that we are referring to now, would it be the same document that you may have been shown having it in your hand in some TV?
yes,
news?
well, we compared the photograph with this.
Okay, all right. Now, you say you got it from just
Digital
social
media.
media? Social media. Okay. So you don't know whether it is or it is not the report that the president may reportedly have told senior leaders of the Communist Party about.
It would appear so, but that the Communist Party would be able to confirm for you, Chair.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
What is clear, it seems from your evidence, that apart from this document, no document purporting to be an official document of any intelligence agency in South Africa was ever seen by you.
Yes.
You deal again with the report and how it was dealt with and its potential use by the former president according to reports on the next page. But in the meanwhile, would you just talk of your return to South Africa as you set out in paragraph 158, please?
As I indicated, Chair, we then had a whole day of meetings and made our way back to Heathrow Airport and returned to South Africa. At 1:59, I hinted earlier on at this point, is a note which says on Tuesday, 28 March, so it's the day after our arrival, the day of our arrival, was the day that the court applications regarding the closure of the Gupta business bank accounts in South Africa by several of the major banking institutions was set to commence argument in the Pretoria High Court. It is, of course, possible that had I been removed as Minister of Finance by that time, my successor would have withdrawn the application. So one can surmise, Chair, that the intention was to get rid of us by Monday or Tuesday morning, put in a new minister, and withdraw the application that was made to the Pretoria High Court.
To your knowledge, prior to the hearing of that application, were there colleagues of yours within cabinet, including the president maybe, who may have expressed opposition to your launching that application?
Not that I was aware of.
Oh, okay. It's just that I was following up on your statement that your successor may have withdrawn the application, because if that had happened, it may have been something quite uppermost in somebody's mind that it should be withdrawn.
That's a fair point, Chair. So there's a question of whether there's opposition to the application as opposed to whether there was support for intervention with the banks that they should not close the accounts. So the latter, there's lots of evidence of, right? And the application is just one part of that whole saga. So one can quite imagine that one of the intentions would be that no such court application should take place.
Chair, we are, I hope, half an hour and not more away from concluding the evidence. It is 11:15. Do you wish to take a short adjournment?
Should we maybe go up to past if that will help us to finish, or would you suggest that we take the tea break?
Well, we won't finish by past.
Oh, we won't finish by past. Okay. So you
I
just
know that I'm pressing against time limits.
yeah. Okay, how much more time do you think we...
Half an hour.
About in half an hour.
We'll do our best for half an hour.
Yes, okay, all right. Then maybe let's take this short break until past. So maybe if we resume at past, we can finish at 12 with the Minister. Thank you. We adjourn.
apologies, Chair.
Thank you, Minister. You may proceed, Mr. Pretorius.
Thank you, Chair. Minister Gordhan, you were dealing with the circumstances that prevailed on your return to South Africa in March 2017, shortly before or immediately before you were dismissed. You had dealt with paragraph 159 by referring to the court application in relation to the closure of bank accounts, and perhaps you should deal with events upon your landing at OR Tambo Airport, which you do at paragraph 161.
So, Chair, I indicate in 161 that immediately after Mr. Fuzile and I land at OR Tambo Airport, we make our way to Lutuli House to meet the then Secretary General of the ANC, Mr. Mantashe, to obtain clarity about what was going on. At 161.1, we say that during that meeting with Mr. Mantashe, he informed me that former President Zuma had met with the ANC's top 6 officials the previous day, that some fake intelligence report has been presented to them, and that it was rejected by those in the meeting. 1612, Mr. Mantashe then told me that Mr. Zuma told them that regardless of the intelligence report, his relationship with me had irretrievably broken down. Since this was not my impression of my relationship with the former president, I asked Mr. Mantashe if he had indicated why he felt our relationship had irretrievably broken down. Mr. Mantashe indicated that he did not. Mr. Mantashe recounted that Mr. Zuma had indicated that it was unusual that the Minister, Deputy Minister, and Director General were all out of the country. I've indicated to you, Chair, that the Deputy Minister was still in the country. I corrected him that Mr. Jonas had not left South Africa, and Mr. Mantashe seemed to be shocked by this fact. At 1614, I say that I believe
Mr. Molefe arise in that discussion.
I believe that Mr. Zuma had mentioned Brian Molefe as a possible replacement as Minister of Finance, but that this suggestion was rejected by members of the top 6 at that meeting. At 1615, as an aside, I note that Mr. Molefe, who had resigned from Eskom following the Public Protector's State of the Capture report, was sworn in as a member of Parliament for the ANC. Speculation at the time was that this was a precursor or event leading up to his replacing me as Minister of Finance. Almost a year earlier, in April 2016, Mr. Buthelezi also was sworn in as a Member of Parliament for the ANC, and speculation suggested that he was earmarked to be Mr. Molefe's Deputy Minister. At 1616, if I may continue.
If you were to summarize briefly the discussion between yourself and Mr. Mantashe regarding your status or contemplated status as Minister.
I think the important point here, Chair, is that Mr. Mantashe indicated to me that Mr. Zuma would prefer if I would resign rather than him having to fire me. And we had covered this issue previously of firing and dismissal resignation. And that, of course, it would suit everybody if we had just resigned. And as I indicated earlier, many comrades and colleagues were saying that it's important to stay on, and that if Mr. Zuma chooses to fire us, then so be it. And that would actually draw a line in the sand, so to speak, and expose to the public what was really going on in terms of the state capture agenda, and how appointments and dismissals of ministers was related to that. At 1617,
Sorry, before you go on, did you consider the alternative of resigning in the interest of the finances of the country?
well, as we say here, we've always tried to put the national interest first. I mean, we could have, in London, said we're taking the day off, cancelled all the meetings, and waited at Heathrow Airport until the flight was ready. Rather, we did that which was in the national interest, which is almost pretend, as if nothing had happened. And at some of those meetings, we were even asked, as I had told you before, Chair, how long are you going to be in that chair? Which is not a very nice thing for any human being to be subjected to, but that's fine. In the national interest, we've had to bear that burden and carry on. So if I can just cover 1617, so in sum, we refused to resign, and we were ready to be fired. I understood that from Mr. Montage, that I was likely to be removed, and that the issue of my replacement was to be discussed again the following Monday. Mr. Fuzile was, of course, very distraught, and he can speak for himself a little later, and was also himself considering resigning. However, he's...
I'm sorry. In terms of the discussion between yourself and Mr. Mantashe, was the discussion, or was Mr. Mantashe saying that you and your then Deputy, Mr. Jonas, were both, there was a risk that you could both be asked to resign or be dismissed, or he was just talking about you?
No, it applied to both of us.
Oh, okay. And the Director General then was not being mentioned?
No.
Okay.
That would be the job of the incoming minister.
Oh, okay, okay.
And so credit to Mr. Fuzile here, Chair, that notwithstanding his frustrations at all of these developments, he continued to serve the country as Director General of the Treasury until very recently. And he's been at the Treasury for 20 years. So I returned to my office at the National Treasury that afternoon. The next day was the funeral of the late Mr. Ahmed Kathrada at the West Park Cemetery. And on Thursday, the SACP issued a media statement recording that it had been informed on Monday, the 27th of March, by Mr. Zuma that I was to be replaced as Minister of Finance. The statement recorded that the SACP objected to this intended reshuffle.
Before you go on, Minister, the statement that you're referring to appears at page 2705 of Bundle N1F. Yes, please, continue. You may do so with reference to the statement if you wish. I just wanted to place that on record.
It was also noted that it had laid a complaint with the Inspector General of Intelligence and the Minister of State Security regarding what it called a rogue intelligence unit that, in our view, gathers data illegally, produces false reports, and feeds them into the political and public domain to smear comrades. And that seems to have become a national sport in South Africa more recently, if I may comment on that. I do not know the status of that complaint.
You say in your statement, I do not know the status of that complaint, but it is a matter that may be the subject of further investigation on the part of the Commission. The fact that the Inspector General of Intelligence and the Minister of State Security were asked to investigate what might well have been a report or a rogue report of some influence. Would you have expected some response from the Inspector General and Minister of State Security concerned generally, apart from your personal interest in the matter?
Well, in respect of the Minister of State Security, certainly as cabinet colleague, if there's an issue that is raised, he should be responding. But if
Were you ever asked about the contents of the report by any official law enforcement agency?
No.
Or investigative agency?
No. But Chair, I was interviewed much later, I don't have a date in front of me, by the Inspector General on the question of this report. So I'm not sure whether he's completed his investigations and so on.
Have you ever been given any feedback as to the authenticity of the report?
No.
Then would you...
Well, maybe you might not have the date in front of you of when you were interviewed, but are you able to give an idea? We're talking about sometime last year, we're talking about sometime this year?
No, probably last year.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. The evening of 30 March 2017, you record that an announcement was made. Could you deal with that briefly, please, as it was a brief announcement, I understand?
Well, by Thursday, as a result of the Communist Party statement, rumors were rife as to when these changes would be announced. And it seems that on Thursday evening, there were meetings taking place at Mashtamba and Lovu, and many of us were watching the TV screens to establish what was actually going on. And finally, it was just past midnight, if I recall correctly, on the 30th of March, when we heard the announcement that a number of us, Minister Hanakam, Minister Ramatlodi, amongst others, and including Deputy Minister Jonas, had been dismissed, and various replacements were announced by the President as well. In 165, I indicate that I had no contact with the former President regarding his decision to remove me as Minister of Finance. In other words, in anticipation of any question, there was no courtesy granted at all of a telephone call, a meeting, or any explanation. And that's where it stands as we sit today.
But during your second term as Minister of Finance, had the former President ever raised with you any issues of concern that he may have had about the relationship between the two of you? Seeing that Mr. Matashe was saying that he said there was a breakdown of the relationship.
Not at all. I know Mr. Zuma, chairperson, which I forgot to mention on the first day, from 1974, when he was released with, I think, about 8 or 9 others from Robben Island. And they were the first batch of Robben Islanders to be released in KwaZulu-Natal as we know it today. And my comrades and I actually serviced him, inverted commas, meaning transported him to various places and assisted him in minor ways at that time as a kind of underground activity. And I also financially assisted him to leave the country. It was 76 or 77. We didn't earn much in those days. But, and then met him when I crossed the borders of South Africa and Swaziland illegally with another comrade, and met him in Swaziland for a whole weekend before I returned to South Africa as well. So as far as relationships are concerned, at that sort of level, there's never been a problem. So I don't know, and it's in the normal employer-employee kind of relationship or situation that one talks about irretrievable breakdowns, not in a political context. But he's the president, and as we always say, we serve at his pleasure. So if he decides to part ways, that's his choice.
When former Minister Nene was giving evidence before the commission, there were maybe 1 or 2, I don't know if more, instances of interaction either between him and the former president, or with people who would report back to him, that one could see may have made the relationship difficult, and Mr. Nene testified about that, and one is not talking about what was right, what was not right, simply objectively that there were those situations where for example, I think the issues that happened when there was a meeting in Russia about the nuclear deal, and the former Minister of Energy, Ms. Jumat Peterson. Yeah. But in terms of the evidence that you have given yourself, I can't remember hearing any encounters where there could have been maybe that may have shown very clearly any serious issues. I know that there was the one where you went to him after you were served with the 27 questions, and I don't know if protested is the right word, but you expressed certain views about it, and you did say, he didn't say much other than flipping through the letter and saying he would talk to the Minister of Police. Am I missing anything that one could really say did happen that could be said to reflect a breakdown in the relationship between the two of you, other than maybe just differences of opinion on certain issues relating to work?
Chair, what I would say is that if one accepts as an hypothesis the betrayal of the promised notion of state capture, then yes, there would be a number of developments, Denel Asia, the Gupta bank accounts, the nuclear issue, and so on, all of which, the Petro SA issue, all of those are the ones we highlight here, the changes to the SAA board, the Airbus deal, and the swap that between myself and Minister Nene at different stages we had decisions to make. Each of those would have constituted interference in the project, if you like, and distractions which probably were not acceptable by both him and those working with him, like the Guptas and others that we've named before. So this is, I would imagine, not about the cordiality issue. This is about, if the hypothesis is right, and I'll come back to that in my closing remarks, then the Treasury was standing in the way by saying, can we test the numbers? Can we check the viability? Can we understand the business case? Have you followed the right procedure? As opposed to just signing off on whatever it is that is actually requested, which might have been the expectation. But we do have laws in this country, and we do have procedures to follow in this country as well. And a public servant is required to, as you would, I'm sure, say, to work within the confines of the Constitution and the law, which is what they do, by and large.
Yeah, because, as I see it, it seemed to me that a breakdown of a relationship, it's like maybe there's been confrontation, confrontation on certain issues. But from what you have said, I mean, even with those things where you may be said on your evidence to have stood in the way of what he may have wanted to happen, my understanding from your evidence is that you simply took certain principled decisions or positions based on your understanding of the legal requirements and of how things should be done, but nothing more than simply insisting on what you believed was right.
That's a fair summary, Chair.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. At paragraph 166, Minister, you deal with the reaction and the expressions of concern at the hands of global ratings agencies. You dealt yesterday and the day before about the role that ratings agencies played, and you did express, or you have expressed here, a desire to place on record what their responses are. Do you still wish to do so?
If I can just point you to a few phrases, if I may, very quickly. So in 166.1, Moody's says the abrupt change in the fourth line in leadership of key government institutions would allow Moody's to assess these risks, and if the changes in leadership signal a weakening in the country's institutional, economic, and fiscal strength. So you can see how the institutional factor begins to enter the equation. 166.2, Standard & Poor essentially say the same thing, that their view that the divisions in the ANC-led government that have led to changes in executive leadership, including the finance minister, put public policy continuity at risk. This has increased the likelihood that economic growth and fiscal outcomes could suffer. So again, the economic and fiscal consequences. And Fitch essentially says the same things as well in the next paragraph. So I won't go into the detail there just to save time.
Minister, following your removal as Minister of Finance, you then returned to Parliament. You obviously remained a Member of Parliament. Would you deal briefly with that period?
So I chose to remain a Member of Parliament and give that experience once again an opportunity to settle and until we as a family could decide what I needed to do. And it was a good choice because being on the Portfolio Committee on Public Enterprises, and in particular part of the investigation, or what shall we call it? Let's call it an investigation that the committee undertook into Eskom and state capture, was quite revealing and an extremely good experience, and holds me in good stead now in relation to the state-owned entities. And in that regard, Chair, I want to refer you to Bundle N2, page 142, where you have this diagram.
Mr. Putrivas,
you might not want to, but essentially
it might not be necessary to look at it now.
You don't have to look at it now, but
Yeah.
I'll sum up what it indicates, and we're going to try to make copies available for the media as well. But it's from the Eskom booklet I referred to earlier on, which was provided by some academics to the Parliamentary Committee. But it gives you a fascinating relationship between timelines on the one hand and governance processes, coal purchases, the nuclear project, IT deals, and other media deals, and the relationship between changes in the executive and changes in management over a period of time. And if you take this and plant it, if you like, onto the hypothesis of state capture, you can see that the fit is quite precise.
Thank you.
So that is just to help the Commission get a concrete example of state capture in a particular institution, which you'll see in, as the lawyers would say, mutatis mutandis, in different instances as well.
Chair, there will be evidence in relation to each state-owned entity that is relevant to the terms of reference of this Commission in detail, which will deal, amongst other things, with matters such as those raised on that document.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I think that's very important. Yeah.
So at 168, Chair, just to end off that part, that inquiry, which is the right word, into Eskom, revealed the extent of manipulation of the boards of the SOCs, as I indicated, their management, the abuse of contracts and procurement processes for corrupt and unlawful ends. And there's any number of examples, Chair, that can be used from the Eskom experience to lend credibility to the argument that changes in ministers, boards, management, and contracting and vendors, if you like, were all part of a fairly organized scheme to defraud big institutions like Eskom.
That is a question which will be further dealt with in evidence, and in his report, interim or final, the Chair will be asked to draw conclusions in that regard, particularly in regard to the concept of state capture in relation to the concept of corruption. You then, Minister, if we may go to your return to Cabinet and your current role as Minister of Public Enterprises, briefly.
All I want to say there, Chair, is that the new President Ramaphosa, reshuffled Cabinet on the 26th of February 2018, and I was then appointed Minister of Public Enterprises. And as I've indicated, we have about 7 SOCs or SOEs that actually report to us. And also, as I indicated to you, that the department itself is trying to collate as much information as we have access to so that we can provide it to the Commission and its investigators, and there's an ongoing dialogue and interaction between the department and yourselves, and that in many of the institutions now we are engaged in the process of, if you like, recapturing them or arranging boards and management and procurement and other systems in order that they execute the kind of mission that they were designed to actually do. And there's a fair amount of success on the one hand, but also not insignificant pushback. And so much of the public outcry that we see and the noise that we had yesterday, for example, arises from the fact that they have many parties who would not like this commission to go too deeply into, say, the issues of Eskom, for example, so, and understand who were the key players involved in the state capture process itself.
Before you take the opportunity to make your closing remarks as contained in the last few pages of your statement, may I ask a few unconnected questions of you, Minister? The first is that on the 27th of April 2017, you gave an interview to Christine Amanpour of CNN. And in that interview you were asked, do you have any information that might implicate former President Zuma in any acts of corruption? And your answer was, I don't have any personal information, but as I said, there are all sorts of suggestions, not just about the former president, but about people in the private sector and the people in the public sector, and that information needs to be tested. That was in April 27. Has the status of your knowledge changed since then?
I think the knowledge of South Africans generally has changed from about June 2017, when the Gupta leaks emerged and enabled us to both see many more dots and connect many more dots and have far deeper information as well. And then secondly, as we get into the SOEs now, you can see the level of malfeasance on the one hand, but institutional damage on the other hand as well. And recovering from this is going to take quite some time. So yes, certainly one has a better grasp of what has been going on now than then.
Then, Minister, in the supplementary bundle, particularly at page 109, that's bundle N2, there's some documentation that the legal team provided you with regarding South African Airways. And if I may just ask you a question in relation to that documentation. Do you have any recollection of your interactions with Minister Gigaba at that time, prior to 26 September 2012? I know it's 5 years ago, but the guarantee that you were asked to provide was provided sometime after it was requested, and the question is whether you had any communications with Minister Gigaba about the provision of the guarantee or your intentions in that regard.
No, I don't have any firm recollections. But as I indicated, Chair, you will recall how the guaranteeing or applications for guarantee are dealt with. So just to refresh our memories, an institution or a ministry or department would come to apply to the Treasury and say, can we have a guarantee of X for Y purpose? That is then put before a fiscal liability committee made up of senior officials in the Treasury, who will both look at documentation and interview people or discuss with people from the relevant institution the nature of the project that they are looking for the finances for or the guarantee for. And guarantees are often related to borrowing. So if you have a guarantee from the state, most financial institutions will then lend you money. Although that's not the case right now. There's a lot of hesitancy because of the nature of damage that has been done to SOEs. So even salaries are difficult to find, or the money for salaries at this point in time. The FLC will then make a recommendation to the Director General, and that would then come as a recommendation to myself. And either, if there's any area of disagreement, there's further dialogue between the DG and the Fiscal Liability Committee. Mr. Fuzile is probably here by now, so he can help you with a lot more details because he goes through that stuff. And then we decide whether a guarantee is given or not. So usually we're not in the business of saying in advance you will get a guarantee, because we've got to wait for this process to be completed.
Minister Gigaba may well come to the Commission to give evidence in regard to these events. It's being dealt with separately under the South African Airways banner and will be dealt with in due course. I have no prior knowledge of what Mr. Gigaba will say, but if he were to say that there was a delay between 9 September when the request was given and 26 September 2012 when the request was finally approved, is there any explanation for that delay? And I think you've given it now.
I've given you an indication of the process.
Then, Minister, just one question in relation to page 25 of your statement. My apologies, it's paragraph 25 of your statement. On page 12, in paragraph 24, you talk about a vision which constitutes government objective, as you say there, and the general objectives of the governing party's goals and objects. And you say in paragraph 25, this is the vision that was attacked by state capture, including by those at the highest levels of the executive. To whom are you referring there?
Well, those who participated in the processes, depending on the conclusion you arrive as a commission, of changing boards, changing managers, allowing malfeasance to actually occur in terms of the hypothesis of state capture that I put forward to you.
And in the executive?
The executive could mean a minister, or the president, or the deputy president, or whoever.
Any particular members of the executive that you wish to name?
No, it's not for me to indicate who they are. I think as you go through diagrams like this one in Eskom, it tells you very clearly who was in office when what happened. wouldn't like to do the job of the Commission.
Then, Minister, you spoke about your acceptance of a position as the GCEO, General Chief Executive Officer of Transnet at a stage. And you spoke of your acceptance of that position, and then it seems you were dissuaded from accepting the position, and later you were appointed as minister. Do you have any knowledge of, firstly, who would have sought to dissuade you from accepting the position and the reasons therefore? And I don't necessarily ask you to speculate, but there are various reasons that might spring to mind and might become more obvious once the evidence before this commission is complete. I just need to close the gap now that you're in the witness box, as it were, to know if you have any knowledge of the circumstances surrounding those events.
Now, clearly, Chair, at that time, we're talking about a period just before elections. So some members of the top 6 of the ANC would probably already begin to look at issues of how do they design the new administration, how many departments would they have, and who are possible candidates for particular positions as well. And they have probably came to some conclusion about whether they wanted me for a particular position or a range of positions or possibilities. And on that basis, gave me a message which says, hold on, don't accept this job. And you don't ask for details when those things happen. That's the discipline we've grown up with. And await the final decision that they make. So if one wasn't appointed as a minister, then one goes and looks for another job.
Yes. Minister, finally, just one particular issue and one general issue. One of the topics that the legal team is investigating in relation to the various state-owned entities is the issue of governance, and in particular the manner in which senior personnel and executives, members of boards are appointed, and in particular vetted for appointment, what checks and balances are put in place. And it's relevant to the recommendations that the chair may be asked to make or may decide to make in relation to governance issues, appointments and dismissals of senior executives and board members. Just one example that has been brought to the attention of the legal team is that of Mr. George Sibolelo, for example. Now, I know that he wasn't appointed, I'm informed that he wasn't appointed under your watch, as it were, but he did resign because of a conflict of interest. Are you satisfied with the steps taken by SOEs prior to appointments in order to vet candidates for positions, and thereafter the checks and balances that are put in place thereafter to ensure, for example, that there are no conflicts of interest?
I don't think one can ever be satisfied about those sorts of issues, but what you have in South Africa is these various codes, like the King 4 code, would say follow these procedures. You also have protocols, if you like, at a board meeting, which says declare your interest. And it's up to the individual to exercise their ethical beliefs, if you like, and foundations, and indicate the conflict of interest in one way or the other. In that particular case, Chairperson, the conflict of interest was brought to my attention by Mr. Mabuza, who's the chair of the Eskom board, and the Eskom board dealt with that matter and made me aware of the fact that Mr. Sibolelo finally decided to resign, having understood that there was this very serious conflict of interest that required him to get off the board. So I think we can always improve.
Then in paragraph 170 of your statement, you record that the Department of Public Enterprises will be providing the Commission with information, particularly in regard to corporate governance, procurement, and accountability, and I trust that offer still stands.
As long as I'm there, yes.
You wished to make closing remarks?
If I may, Chair. So,
Well, maybe before you do so, let me ask some questions so your closing remarks can be closing remarks. In your statement, I had the relevant page here. In paragraph 10 of your statement, you say, reflecting on the period 2009 to 2017 now, it would appear that I was witness to events, some of which are set out below, and it seems an unwitting member of an executive in the earlier part of this period, which was misled, lied to, manipulated, and abused in order to benefit a few families and individuals, in order to release the worst forms of recklessness and corruption, in order to rob ordinary people of schools, clinics, education, in order to abuse and decimate key institutions of our democracy, including SARS, and you mentioned others, and in order to damage the economy, increasing joblessness, forsaking the youth, and increasing the marginalization of women. Are you able to specify who lied to this executive and misled this executive and manipulated it, if I understand this correctly?
no, I think in the first instance, the President did. So asking us to look at intervention into the relationship between banks and their clients, for example, pushing the nuclear deal, as was indicated already. And if one then again comes back to the hypothesis of state capture, allowing for particular types of boards in SOEs to be established, putting in place particular ministers or others who might be cooperative in this venture as well. All that, if you look at it retrospectively now, if one accepts the hypothesis, means that there was a scheme at play, designed by somebody. And I hope that by the time you complete your work, Chair, you would tell South Africa, who is this somebody? I mean, we've heard various anecdotal accounts of diagrams in walls at certain compounds and so on, saying, we finished this target, who's the next target that we're actually aiming for? The timing of appointments and dismissals and how they coincide with some of the projects at play. Once the other projects come under your purview as well, I think you will be able to put those pieces of the puzzle together in the way that I suggest.
No, thanks. My other question is this. If at the end of this process, I come to the conclusion that definitely there was state capture, and I keep on reminding everybody that the terms of reference say it's allegations, so we are looking into the allegations. If I come to the conclusion that there was state capture, I obviously need to establish who were the players in the state capture. I also need to look at how did state capture come about? I need to look at what are the things that facilitated the happening of state capture. Is there any environment that provided fertile ground for state capture to happen in the way in which it has happened? I've got to also look at who or what institutions ought to have done something. And if they had done that which maybe they should have done, maybe state capture would not have gone the extent I might find it will have gone. And so I would have to look at all of those things. And obviously one looks also at what measures should be put in place to make sure it doesn't happen again, or at least to minimize the chances that it could happen again. Now, the governing party, and I'm making sure I'm saying governing party. The governing party, I don't know what position it will take. I know that it has encouraged people, and I assume including its members, to come forward and if they've got information, and assist the commission. And you are here, you are, excuse me, you are here to give the commission evidence that you have knowledge of. But one of the questions that probably I would have to ask if I find that there was state capture would be, is there something that the governing party ought to have done itself? And I go back to the question I mentioned earlier, that it's the electorate that gave, during this relevant period, the governing party the power to govern. When did it realize that there was something wrong going on here? When did it realize that it looks like the state was being captured? What did it do about it? Now, there is, or there may be a risk, I shouldn't say there is, there may be a risk that the governing party and maybe some of its members or maybe some of its leaders might feel that its members should not say anything negative about whatever role it ought to have played and didn't play, and so on. If that happens, it would be a pity, because then this process would be all the poorer. For this process to be enriched, it's very important that everybody who knows something be encouraged to come forward and say what they want to say, without fearing that they may be marginalized by whoever, including by their own party, even if they say something that the leadership of the party might not be happy about. But we need to get to the bottom of this, and we need to know who should have done what. Did they do it? And if they didn't do it, why not? So I ask the question whether, in your view, there is anything that the governing party, I know that they will come and talk, but you are a senior member of the governing party, and you certainly have views on issues, and those views may be beneficial to the Commission. Is there anything that you have looked at and said, look, the governing party probably should have done A, B, C, D? It might not be exhaustive but certain things, if it had done this or that by that time, maybe state capture could have been arrested at a certain time. That's the one question The other question I want to ask is whether within the governing party, the environment, and when I say environment, I include the practices of the party, the constitution and everything, the traditions, are such or were such during the relevant period that members of the party would have been encouraged, would have felt encouraged that if they thought the ruling party should do something about something like this, they would be able to stand up within the party and say, no, but this must be sorted out, the party must do this, the leaders must do this, and they would be able to say that without fear of any repercussions, whether of not being promoted to some position, or of not being put in a list to go to Parliament, or fear of losing some job. In other words, I would like to see that, because obviously a party such as a political party can be influenced in a serious way to take certain decisions if its members think it should take a certain direction.
It's a complex set of issues, Chair.
Yes,
let me see what I can do to
yes.
assist. I think I don't claim to be an expert, but politics, governance, and patronage go together. The question is, how do you use the powers and authority that you have to dispense patronage in the least malicious way and with the least harm to people concerned as your best bet? I don't think there's a country in the world or a stage in history, I'm guessing, where patronage wasn't a feature of governance. The second is that it's very important to have a well-informed and active citizenry. And we don't do enough of that in democracies, certainly not in ours. So we operate today very much on sound bites of one kind or another, and depending on the preferences of the intermediaries or interlocutors that we have, who have their own worldviews and their own biases, and perhaps their own inclinations as well, in terms of what needs to be communicated and what needs to be supported or not. But informed citizens who understand what budgeting means, where public resources are located, what the role of state-owned entities are or is, and what's the responsibility of public representatives who fill the shoes in those particular institutions, can then hold those people to account. What the world is going through, and indeed South Africa is going through, is a period in which there's a raging populism from certain quarters, which in a sense manipulates public opinion and manipulates people at the end of the day, based on lies, slogans, fake news, and other kinds of suggestions, hoping that that would, on the one hand, promote them politically into office or into so-called kingmaker roles, and on the other hand, mask, as you said, their efforts. And there's a lot of, part of this whole Fightback campaign from all there's not just one party in this, in this equation, but part of this Fightback campaign is about taking every possible measure to mask the malfeasance that is going on and obfuscate it as much as possible. And that's where, if you remember, I use the term the politics of distraction. Distract people away from where the actual activity is occurring. So it is in that context that every governing party, or every political party for that matter, has to ask itself, in seeking public office and the support of citizens to win elections, on the one hand you have manifestos, on the other hand you have principles, and on the third hand you have actual human beings who want to build careers out of this. So once you have politics as your career and your sole source of income, then you become captive to that particular project as well and begin to serve a particular purpose. And that purpose is often self-serving rather than public-serving at the end of the day. And so I think what I indicated at the outset was the various resolutions and reports that the then Secretary General prepared and presented, the diagnostic report, the final resolution at the NASREC conference, and so on, to indicate that in policy terms and philosophy terms, we do say the right things. We have the right kind of focus. The question is, what is the relationship between the principle, if you like, and the outlook that we adopt and the actual practice? And what would it take for people to have that gap between practice and principle as small as possible, if at all that is possible? And I think you've identified that there are a number of factors, as you put it, that might intervene in people deciding whether to stand up for certain things or not. So I think principles are one thing. And the other, I might have pointed out in the earlier part of my testimony, that you see in boards of SOEs as well, and that is that, do you have the courage to do it? So courage means you're going to take some risks as well. And taking the risks means you're sticking your neck out, either in a, and it now appears, sticking your neck out in a literal sense, not just a figurative sense, with the kinds of threats that we see being made in the public domain. So I think each of us will have to excruciate on this issue and say, could I have done better? Could I have done differently? And President Ramaphosa is attempting to steer us in a way in which we begin to find, if you like, our moral center of gravity again and moral focus again. And part of the renewal project in the ANC is to get that right. Whether we succeed or not, we'll know in 2 or 3 years' time. But there will always be different interests in any human organization. And some would be very short-termist and self-focused, and others will actually focus on the national interest and the broader objectives that a movement like the ANC stands for. And one not just hopes, but the activists who are driven by the broader objectives hopefully are the ones who can drive the organization in the right kind of direction. But if you have an informed citizenry, they will hold us to account. They at least have either the elections or other public fora in which they can say, we don't like what you're doing. And we don't like the way you're spending our money. We don't think you are giving the service that we actually require. And that's not about politicians, it's also about public servants as well. And I think it's that mix that we need to get right as we go forward. But you raise very important questions.
No, thank you very much. Before you do your closing, then I just want to say, I did mention at the end of Ms. Barbara Hogan's evidence that in due course we will ask, many stakeholders in the country, including civic organizations, maybe churches, political parties, to start thinking about giving suggestions of possible recommendations to deal with certain issues that fall within the terms of reference of the Commission, giving them enough time to ensure that those who want to do research before they prepare their submissions, they have enough time before the Commission finishes its work, because in the end we want to be able to involve the public to the extent that we can in resolving some of these national problems. So I take this opportunity to say, I think the Department of Public Enterprises, as the department that is fully involved with the public enterprises, and that may have a lot of information as to what is happening or what happened, should consider that it will also be most welcome for it at some stage to give suggestions, of how they think some of the problems relating to SOEs can be and should be resolved, what measures this commission should consider recommending in order to make sure that what happened doesn't happen again. The department would have people who are fully involved on the ground on some of the issues, and one can get lots of benefit from people who have that kind of involvement in any matter. So I extend the same invitation to you as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. You subject to whether Mr. Pretoria still has any questions, I'm happy that you can give your closing
One
remarks.
brief issue, Minister. In answer to the question from the Chair in relation to the contents of your paragraph 10, you were asked to identify parties who had misled or lied, manipulated Cabinet and others, and your answer was the President.
Enabling me and my colleagues to put forward the statement that I did. And I must indicate that I did so voluntarily, although the Commission went through certain processes of its own and under oath as well. And I hope that what we've exchanged with you enables the Commission to succeed in the endeavors that you have set out, Chair. The second point I want to make is that as far as the governing party is concerned, I've set out the various documents at the outset and made reference to them again a moment ago. The third is that we all working under the mandate in some ways that the President and the governing party has defined, that we have to work on our unity within the organization. But that unity, as you correctly pointed out, needs to be based on firm principles. And unanimity or sufficient consensus on those principles as well. There's agreement, as the President has articulated, that state capture must be fought, it must be ended, and that everything possible must be done to uncover what has happened, and that there must be consequences for those who've caused this immense damage to our economy and to our country, and the consequences for people on the ground at the end of the day. And what this involves, as you correctly pointed out, and the President did in the State of the Nation address as well, is that we've now got to rebuild a whole range of institutions with the right kind of leadership and management and integrity that would ensure that they actually serve the country as they're supposed to. As opposed to the kind of new dawn that the President speaks of and which we support, and which was beginning to gain traction and create a level of hope and confidence in our country, we also regrettably are seeing this fightback phenomenon, which I have described repeatedly, which is now becoming, I would suggest, Chair, dangerous, because it is now attacking the Commission. It is now attacking people appearing before the Commission. It is now attacking families of people appearing before the Commission, a point that I will come to. And what we're seeing is not just the politics of destruction. We're also seeing a very practical manifestation of something I was taught in the early 1970s by a much older political leader. And that phenomenon is my enemy's enemy is my friend. And so all sorts of new alliances are being drawn. partly in order to attack this process and stop the revelations that would uncover what individuals are up to, but also significantly so that it would assist in the elections that are coming in 2019 as well. Some amongst the people who are engaged in this, of course, have aspirations that they'll become the president or the deputy president. And when you have a very loose political foundation and probably no principles at all to back up what one is engaged in, then anything goes in the politics. And one, I think, needs to be careful about their attempts to obstruct the cleanup process, to allow the looting to actually continue, and allow for uncontrolled access to resources and for their personal ambitions to actually be materialized. And I'm sure that the Commission will look into the kind of attacks that officials of the Commission are being subjected to as well. And government, I'm sure, will share your concerns in that particular regard. I make reference to the fact that the people appearing before you, Chair, but before I get there, we also pointed out the key features of state capture as per the hypothesis painted in the betrayal of the promise document. And I want to suggest that even in our presentation, there's sufficient evidence to begin to put a picture together, certainly if you look at the Eskom instance in a more concrete sense, to fill those boxes that were appearing in the diagram in the attachment that we had, to indicate who was in control and command of this project, what were the roles played by members of the executive or boards or officials in departments or executive managers, particularly those who had positions like CEOs and CFOs within that kind of set of institutions. The kind of activity they engaged in, which focused on identifying what kind of procurement did each of these institutions undertake, what did the supply chain look like, and how could they intervene in that environment. But more importantly, where did the pools of money lie? Where were the pools of cash in the state? And as I indicated to you, they lie in procurement, they also lie in the treasuries of the big institutions, and in advisory services that are offered. At a recent international conference, there was an interesting slogan that emerged. Capture is the name, procurement is the game. And it tells a lot about even the global experience in this particular regard as well. There's an area that we didn't look at specifically in this context, which is the role of legal departments within SOEs, who legitimize contracts and overlook certain things that they're supposed to look at a lot more carefully, which as the Commission proceeds, it could look at as well. The other boxes were about advisors, facilitators, and enablers. And again, the roles of Bell Pottinger, KPMG, Trillion, amongst many others, you will see fit very easily into those boxes in terms of enabling the processes of state capture, and particularly in particular the transmission of money out of institutions as well. So I would suggest that the key features of state capture already appear fairly clearly in the evidence that you have before you, but I'm sure you'll have a lot more that would assist you in this particular regard. I just want to end on two notes. The first is to make reference to the fact that witnesses appearing before the Commission, like myself, are quite willing to be attacked politically, quite willing to be criticized politically, quite willing to be corrected if we presented wrong evidence. But it would be very nice if our critics come forward under oath and present themselves before this Commission. What I'm sure you would agree, Chair, is unacceptable is attacks on families. So yesterday, while we were here, but even before yesterday, there were a whole lot of wrong information about my daughter that was put out in the public domain. And I want to put forward the following for the record. This information about my daughter is for the public to understand that she has not engaged in any malfeasance of any kind. Secondly, she joined Investec Bank Limited, the private equity division, in 2007 and resigned in late 2017. Thirdly, most financial service institutions, as many in this room would know, invest capital, either their own money or third-party investor money, in emerging privately owned businesses. Fourthly, the private equity division at Investec invested in privately held companies on behalf of Investec Bank Limited, not on her own behalf. Fifth, Investec, that is the bank concerned, and could be any other name, therefore is the owner of the shares that they buy. Not my daughter. It's the bank that owns that share of these private businesses. She was an employee in this division and part of a team of 12 private equity professionals who were appointed as non-executive directors to the boards of these companies as a representative of Investec as the owner of the shares. 6, private equity professionals from this team represented Investec on the boards of each company. It's not her money. Their job is to look after the money of the bank and the investors. In other words, employees of the bank, like employees of the Public Investment Corporation, who invest in companies, are, what shall we call it, nominated onto boards of those companies to ensure that the governance is right and the money is actually secure. That's the same practice that I'm describing here as well. This investing process then helps smaller businesses to grow and create jobs. So private equity is an important contributor if it's done the right kind of way. 7, she did not benefit financially in any way. That is, she did not own any shares in these businesses directly and did not benefit from any direct fees. The fees go to the bank, not to her or to the employee, or other financial compensation from these companies. The benefits went to the bank and its investors. 8, she was not a member of the management or executive teams of these businesses. 9, none of the directorships of my daughter were in her personal capacity and were always on behalf of her employer, as I indicated. 10, the allegations of using the relationship with myself to get access to government tenders to benefit these companies is a blatant lie, and these dangerous and unfounded allegations have been made to intimidate and harass my family and myself. 11, she does not have any bank accounts in Canada, and for the record, nor do I, and has not had any financial interest in Canada either. She went there to do a banking course at some stage. And 12, my daughter has not done any business with the state. So I want to repeat the fact that let's not play the man, as they say, play the ball. If there are political objectives that anybody wants to achieve, well, come to me and direct your attention to me, and I will answer for whatever I have to answer for. Don't choose vulnerable targets, because that means, Chair, that the witnesses are going to be extremely hesitant to appear before you if we allow these processes to continue without any opposition. The last point is 2 quotations and one other, Chair, from President Mandela. Because part of what is going on is the descent to racism that we are seeing unfolding in this country as a cheap political mechanism to launch attacks. And I quote President Mandela when he says, "I detest racialism because I regard it as a barbaric thing, whether it comes from a black man, and I imagine woman, or a white man or woman." And the second quotation, "There is no easy walk to freedom anywhere. Many of us And many of us will have to pass through the valley of the shadow of death again and again before we reach the mountain tops of our desires. So these are timely, I think, reminders to us that the challenges that we face as a country are quite formidable and not going to be easily overcome. There's one very well-known poem that I end on, Chair, which is following on what you've said, to others to come forward and take the stand, so to speak, and make a contribution to your project that you've been assigned, which I'm sure many of you might be familiar with. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And hopefully we don't get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Minister. I think what remains is for me to say one is looking at some of the things that are happening and some of the things that have been said, and one is looking into that in order to decide what should be done. It is, there can be no doubt that within the country one can find certain people who would not like this commission to be there, who would not like this commission to continue, who would not like this commission to succeed. And then one will find also many people who want this commission, who want this commission to succeed, and who want this commission to be given enough space to do its job for the nation properly. And indeed, and as I have said in the past, my own experience through interaction with ordinary people in our country is that a very large section of our society has full support for this commission and the work that people involved with this commission are doing. They have an appreciation of the sacrifices that are being made. They speak about, they express concerns about our safety, and they are very concerned. Really, nothing that is done or said by anybody will be allowed to deter people who want to come forward and assist this commission. And of course, the commission will look at what it itself can do to make sure that people continue to feel free to come forward. But thank you very much. We may ask you to come back at some stage if, because I understand that there are implicated parties who wish to be granted leave to cross-examine you. I have not been given any complete application in that regard, so I will make a decision in regard to each application once it is before me. But then proper arrangements would be made for you to make yourself available again. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Chair. My apologies to the legal team and Mr. Fuzile. I've been keeping him waiting from 10 o'clock this morning.
Oh, okay. But thank you for your time. And You referred, I just mentioned this, and maybe the legal team may or may not have talked to you about it. You referred to having come here voluntarily and referring to certain processes. I just want to indicate that there is no doubt about you having come here voluntarily, and whatever processes might have happened, they should not detract from that. Thank you very much. You are excused. I see, Mr. Pretorius, that we are at 9 minutes to 1 o'clock.
Yes, Chair. There remains one matter that should not take a vast amount of time, and in the interests of the witnesses and the evidence leaders who are going to lead them this afternoon, perhaps we could deal very briefly with the condonation application. You have it before you. The notice of motion sets out the relief required, and that is at index page 1, but the content is at page 2.
Yes.
And it asks you to condone the late issue of Rule 33 notices to the persons listed in subparagraphs 2.1 to 2.8. There has been service, albeit by email, but acknowledged to all those persons or their legal representatives, and there's no opposition. We've had discussions with legal representatives, not with all, but with some, and the application for condonation is not opposed. I don't know if you want me to go into any detail further than that, seeing that the matter is not opposed, but at page...
No, I read the papers last night. You might just emphasize if there's anything you want to emphasize. But if all relevant persons were served and they are not opposing, then subject to whatever else you might say, I would be inclined to grant condonation.
Thank you. If I may just point out that the parties were entitled to 14 days' notice. 5 of them received 12 days' notice and 3 of them 11 days. They have recourse to the rules in relation to any prejudice they may have suffered. They don't intend to seek that recourse. So in that respect, subject to one matter which I'd like to raise before you, I ask for the relief set out in the notice of motion on behalf of the legal team. Present today, Chair, is Advocate Chidiso Ramakhali, who is led by Advocate Mpofu to represent Mr. Mayani. Also present is Philip Mahlatsi, who is led by Advocate Semenya, who is here to represent Sean Abrams. Their position is similar. They say to the legal team that they intend, once fully informed, to apply for cross-examination. Amongst other things, they require time to study the transcript of evidence, which went understandably far wider than the text of the statement with which they have been served. And although they don't oppose the application for condonation, they will in due course seek rights to cross-examine before you and to the extent necessary apply for condonation.
Okay, thank you.
They may want to confirm that, Chair.
Yes, okay.
Chairperson.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Chairperson, we do indeed confirm the contents of what has been said by Pretorius SC. In fullness of time, then we'll then be in a position to come back and say, this is our position. I'm not certain at this stage, subject obviously to proper consultation with my client. We'll then be able to make an election, as I have stated on Monday. But as matters stand, thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much.
Chairperson, my name is Tsidisa Mkhale. As Mr. Pistorius confirmed, I act with my leader, Mr. Mbofu, for Commissioner Tom Moyane. I indeed confirm that that's the case, that we'll be seeking an application to cross-examine Minister Gordhan, and that we'll be seeking condonation given the fact that we'll be late in filing our application.
Okay, no, that's fine. Thank you very much. You have nothing further to say on the condonation application, Mr. Pretorius?
No, Chair. At page 2 is the order that is sought.
Sorry?
The order that is sought is at page 2 of the paginated papers.
Well, it starts at page 1, isn't it?
Your microphone, Chair.
Oh, it starts at page 1 and goes on to 2. Do we have the same thing?
Perhaps not, Chair, but perhaps we should refer to paragraphs then.
Well, maybe let me tell you what I have. Page 1 is the following order that is asked for is 1, granting condonation for the failure to timelessly issue notices in terms of Commission Rule 3.3 to persons implicated by the evidence of Mr. Nhlanhla Nene.
Gordhan, yes. That
Oh, this
order
one-
in itself
oh.
would be sufficient. It's just in more detail in paragraph 2.
But am I having the right one then?
Well, that's exactly the one that I'm looking at, perhaps on a different page.
This one I'm reading says Nhlanhla Nene.
No, but then you have the wrong one.
But has that one been granted?
That's to be
That's
granted
separate.
at a later stage.
Okay.
That is a different application with different considerations.
Well, there are some files here which are not marked on the spine. This is the only one that is marked on the spine that says condonation application bundle. Or are there two in the same bundle? Two condonation applications in
There
the same
shouldn't
bundle?
be. There should be separate bundles. May I hand you this up? Chair?
Yes, please. Well, I have now found that one of the affidavits, one of the lever arch files that is not marked on the spine, what it is for, looks similar to the one that have just been handed.
Yes.
But the one that I've been handed from you is written on the spine, application for condonation, Minister Pravin Gordhan,
Yes.
re-implicated persons. But this one doesn't have any writing on the spine at all.
My apologies for that.
And I think there is one other leave-out file that is not written, so I think somebody needs to make sure that they are properly written or marked so that I can...
We'll make sure in future,
Yeah.
Chair, my apologies. The index is a little intimidating, but a little further on you'll find page 1, notice of motion.
Yes. But basically, the non-compliance or the delay in serving the notices was a matter of 2, 3, or 5 days, but
2 to
nothing
3
more
days,
than that.
Chair.
Nothing more than that.
Nothing more than that.
Yes.
And no opposition nor any recourse
Yeah.
to Rule 3.5 by an implicated party.
Okay, all right. No, thank you.
Okay, as I said, Chair, the index is reasonably intimidating, but
Yeah.
after the index you will find the notice of motion, and may I refer you to page 2.
Yeah. No, I'm ready to grant the order.
Thank you, Chair.
I grant paragraphs 1 and 2 of the prayers in the notice of motion at page 2 thereof.
Thank you, Chair.
So we'll take the lunch adjournment now and resume at 2.
Yes. At
we'll
which stage Advocate Maleka will lead Mr. Fuzile.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
So we will now take the lunch adjournment and we'll resume at 2 o'clock. We adjourn.